Welcome, fellow creatures of the night, to this meeting of the Midnight Culture Club. Here we venture deep into the nocturnal lands of the strange, the morbid, the absurd, and the obscure in film, books, TV, fairy tales, urban legends, and many other forms of pop culture. We discuss and analyse these texts to explore the fascinating ways they reflect, comment on, and critique the world we live in from its darker side. I am Xenia, the overmotivated nerd who won't let anyone else get a word in tonight, and I declare this meeting of the Midnight Culture Club officially in session. And this is the first meeting that actually qualifies as a Midnight Culture Club meeting, since I am recording this at 12, so 9 minutes past midnight. We're doing great. I was going to record earlier this evening at like 6ish, but then there was a tech issue and it was very frustrating and I had to have a little cry. But here we are, restored to functioning. I'm happy that you guys are here, despite everything. And if you've listened to the last episode of Midnight Culture Club, the one about cozy crime and the masterpiece that is Murder on the Orient Express, you will know that today's episode is a little bit different. It's a bit of an experiment. And that's because I don't really have a lot of time for scripting at the moment, because I'm buried under a mountain of exams and deadlines and presentations. You can just see a hand twitching, reaching out from beneath, and that's me. That's this episode. And this means that today's ep is going to be a little bit shorter and is also unscripted. Yeah, so from here on I only have a couple bullet points and the rest will be improvised, kind of. So yeah, I hope it'll be somewhat coherent. Let's go! So for this episode I want to talk about a topic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about over, the past 2 years, probably a long time. Basically, since it's become so popular that even I could not miss its existence, and that is the, as I said, massively popular but controversial genre, dark romance. I have to give you a caveat, guys. Me talking about romance is always going to be a little bit difficult because I'm not a romance reader. It's not sort of my preferred genre. By that, I don't mean that I think it's not a valid genre. I know that's a point that's made sometimes. I absolutely don't think that. I think romance novels can be really, really well written. They can have very interesting characters. They can be amazingly well done. I'm just not a huge romance reader. If I have the choice, I'd probably read something else. But I realised that I actually like more romance than I thought I did. I mean, I really like Jane Austen, right? Jane Austen's definitely romance. Not dark romance. Maybe Northanger Abbey goes a bit in that direction. It's definitely not dark romance. But it is romance. And they are excellent romances, right? We have the love plots that are very important to these books, but at the same time, there's also a very compelling world that the whole thing is set in. You know, they're usually very interesting family dynamics and the social, the class differences, the social element, the issues that arise through that are super important. You know, the whole drama around, oh, you're marrying someone below your station or above your station, or people are being tricked because they need to marry someone because otherwise they're going to be basically homeless. It's a very interesting world, right? Where was I going with this? See, I've already gone off topic. This is why I need a script. But yeah, what I wanted to say by that in short is that though I don't read a lot of romance, but it doesn't mean that I think romance isn't a valid genre or that I look down on romance readers. That's something that is very important for me to say at the beginning of this, because that is unfortunately a thing where people will fight about which genres are valid genres, and I think that's not a good point. I think we need to look at things in a lot more detail and with a lot more nuance than that. But why do I want to talk about dark romance? So basically, last week I think on Sunday, Mina on YouTube published a video about dark romance, and I watched it, and I think it's a very good video. She makes some very interesting points. She uses some very interesting sources about, possible psychological reasons behind why people enjoy dark romance, about its link with fan fiction. It's very interesting. I really liked it. But my constant internal response was to be like, oh, I would like to add this, and I would like to add that, and I would like to add this. And then I went to have a shower and I kept monologuing to myself about the topic in the shower. So I thought, well, we might as well make this into an episode, right? And then it got worse, because one of my favorite podcasts, it's a German kind of true crime and mystery podcast. It's called Stimmen im Kopf, and it's a very good podcast. I can recommend. And they did an episode about people who fancy the clown from Terrifier, and people who fancy sort of horror clowns and horror villains in general, and how that comes to be. And a lot of the reasoning behind it is, again, very similar to the appeal of dark romance that Mina talked about. So I kept getting hit over the head with it, so I thought we have to do this. And then my third inspiration is, there's a video series by Rachel Oates, also on YouTube, and she talks about a dark romance series called Zodiac Academy. And in her series, there's this one video where she talks for the first half hour or so about the dark romance genre in general, and she also makes some very good points. So these are three things that I kind of want to draw on a little bit over the course of this episode. But we're also going to talk about things that I actually thought of myself. Can you believe? Okay, that's enough about me and about the sourcing and the inspirations and all of that behind this episode. Just, always make sure to give proper credit to everyone. That's important. Let's actually talk about what dark romance is. Dark romance is a subgenre of romance with dark themes or elements. So these can, for example, be horror elements, elements of danger. A lot of the time it also involves a sort of power imbalance within the relationships. For some reason, a lot of kidnapping. You get kidnapped by someone and that's the love interest. That seems to be quite popular. Sometimes the love interests are powerful supernatural creatures. Sometimes they're millionaires, the two types of power, supernatural creature and millionaire. Also popular gang members or other types of criminals. A lot of the time, dark romance also includes, as an extension of this power imbalance in the relationship, very strong sort of sub-dom dynamics in the sex scenes. In general, there's a lot of explicit kind of taboo sexuality. A lot of the time there's a combination of sex and violence. So, it's kind of edgy romance, I think that is a good way to describe it. It's edgy romance. I also would like to add that most popular dark romance that I have seen around, most of the popular titles, things like Haunting, Adeline is a bit of a classic. Stuff like 50 Shades of Grey is also dark romance. If we go a little bit more innocent, something like Twilight can fit the bill. But then also you get texts that maybe aren't as deliberately dark romance, but they kind of are, that's where I would kind of classify most Colleen Hoover books. And what I think these all have in common, and that's important to point out specifically, is that these big popular dark romances are usually a straight couple where the man is very powerful and the woman is dominated by him and enjoying being dominated, at least after a while. Maybe you can see already based on that description why one of the most common criticisms of the dark romance genre arises. And this criticism is that the genre romanticizes abuse. By giving readers, especially young, inexperienced readers, the idea that if a man locks you in a room because he doesn't want you to meet, another man who you're not even into, but he's nervous about it, that's romantic. Or that if he physically restrains you and then you get turned on by that. That makes it okay that you're being physically restrained. Stuff like that are things that are very common in these texts, and because of that, there is this criticism that these books romanticize abuse. That's what Rachel Oates mostly talks about in her video, and she makes some excellent points, and I will come back to that a little bit later. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what the roots of dark romance are, where sort of in a historical context it would come from. And so I've mentioned this before, I studied literature, so we also had quite a bit of literary history and different periods and different typical genres, and to me, looking at the sort of typical stuff that goes on in dark romance, I instantly have to think of the Gothic genre. And the Gothic genre is a genre that arose in the late 18th and then went on to be very popular in the 19th century. And it is a genre that developed in response, sort of as a counter movement to rationalism and the industrialization that sort of tried to keep the world mysterious and magical. Because of this, the Gothic genre deals a lot with things like dark mysteries, with hidden secrets. A lot of the time there's quite a bit of violence and fear involved. So the classic Gothic novel, for example, would be about a young, innocent female heroine who is somehow drawn into some kind of scheme by a manipulative but charming older male villain. And then at some point she realizes, oh, there's something wrong with this guy, and typically she would then either be saved or sometimes, if a progressive, escape by herself. And before that she would of course find out what this dark secret is. Yeah, so maybe you can already see that there are some parallels there. So we have this dynamic of a kind of virtuous, innocent young woman and a powerful older man who has, oh, I didn't say that before, who has a sexual interest in her as well, and who's trying to corrupt her in some way. That can also be financially, or a lot of the time it's financially actually. Combination of financial and sexual motives are very popular. So I think you can see how this could connect to a genre that usually centers around a male-female couple where the woman is not necessarily innocent, but, you know, more innocent, and the man is powerful and trying to dominate her. So this Gothic connection is something to keep in mind. What's interesting is that the Gothic genre also received a lot of backlash when it first arose, similar to the dark romance genre, because people thought it was absolutely inappropriate and it would get young girls' wrong ideas about romance, and about who they could trust and who they couldn't trust. It's very, very interesting. It's very similar to the criticisms that dark romance sees today. In fact, what I discovered while Googling dark romance is that there was a subgenre of Gothic literature, specifically a subgenre of the German Romantic literary and art movement that's called Schwarze Romantik, which basically means black romance. It's not an emo band, but it should be. And this is very modern dark romance. So this is very similar to Gothic fiction, but there's even more intense themes of violence, madness, death, hauntings. Maybe they're haunting Adeline, I don't know. And these elements in this black romance are linked specifically to the erotic. They're very much heightened and aestheticized. There's these images, these paintings of women lying down, and there's like a sleep paralysis demon on their chest. There's a very famous one by a painter called Fuseli. That kind of vibe, you know. It's very spooky, very dark, very haunting, but also very sexualized. So these stories, if they are stories and not paintings, they don't necessarily involve romance plots in the modern sense. So there's not necessarily a main character and a love interest and they get together or something like that. That's not necessarily the case, but there is this combination of violence and darkness with the erotic and the sexual specifically. And I think it is this combination that really strongly survives in the different types of contemporary dark romance. So the violent and the haunting, I think these are the sort of two extremes. Because contemporary dark romance, based on what I've seen on book social media mostly, very much tends to go into one of two directions. There's the sort of supernatural corner, which would then be the sort of haunting type, where the dark in the dark romance often comes from the fact that the love interest is a supernatural creature, and usually a kind of dangerous but hot one. You know, classic would be vampires and werewolves, and what else is there? Like, I think in the Zodiac Academy series, there's this guy who can transform into a dragon, stuff like that. So they're supernatural creatures that are very powerful and because of that dangerous, and that's where the dark element can come from. And then on the other extreme end, we have this thing of people who are powerful, of love interests that are powerful because they are very wealthy. So here we have the sort of like millionaire end. Both of these extreme ends allow the love interest a lot of power, but they do it in very different ways. We have supernatural means and money. And then, of course, there's also the violence and the crime way of getting to a powerful position. This would then refer to, you know, the cliche here would be the sort of mafia dark romances. Mafia dark romance is a big deal. These are usually also the ones with the kidnapping. So a woman gets kidnapped by the mafia and then they like torture her or whatever. And then she starts hooking up with the kidnappers, and it's because they're so hot and Italian or whatever. I don't, that's how I imagine it in my head. I haven't read any of them. But I've read a lot about them. Before you think I'm completely incompetent, I've read a lot about them. And I've seen a couple movies, so, you know. And I believe that these different types of kind of subsections of ways in which the love interest can become powerful have very different implications. Personally, I think that the purely supernatural type, the type where the dark comes from the supernatural mostly, in my opinion, is the least problematic. So if we get to something that's basically kind of monster romance, you know, where you get like a love interest who's some kind of creature, a lot of the time there it can be kind of silly, you know, all those kind of tentacle monster things. They certainly have a dark element and they're a little bit weird, but if the dark element is simply that the love interest is some kind of funny creature, I think this kind of corner is pretty harmless. Mostly because it is very obvious that it is very, very fictional and has nothing to do with reality. But of course, into this supernatural thing, there can enter elements of emotional or physical violence, manipulation, abuse, you know, these kind of unhealthy power imbalances that appear very often in the dark romance genre. And a typical example of this, although a lighter one, and this is also the example that Mina mentions in her video, is Twilight. Twilight is, and she calls it dark romance light, and I think is a very good term for it. It's kind of like a gateway drug to dark romance. Because in Twilight, if you don't know what Twilight is about, it's about this girl called Bella, and she's a teenager and she falls in love with a guy called Edward, and Edward is a creep who keeps following her around school and then telling her to stay away from him, and then 5 minutes later he shows up behind her again. It's like, oh, you should stay away from him. It makes no sense. And he like keeps gaslighting her, and also he's a vampire and he's immortal and he's like 100 years old, so actually they have a massive age gap even though they look the same age. And then he constantly has to try to stop himself from eating her. So, you know, power imbalance, danger, death and violence, they're all there. And there are some unhealthy relationship dynamics between them. Again, with Edward kind of constantly following her around, being a creep, and, you know, watching her when she's sleeping. For this purpose, he breaks into her house. It's just creepy shit like that. And he's very controlling, you know, these kinds of things. So we have the supernatural, but it bleeds a little bit into the abusive kind of stuff that is then so often criticized. And it's a little bit of a shame, because something like Twilight, if the dark element was simply that Edward is a vampire and he has to really restrain himself not to eat Bella, I keep saying eat, not to drink Bella's blood. You know, it's as if I was constantly confronted by a person that I'm in love with, but also they are made of chocolate. That would be difficult. And if that was the main conflict, you know, about him loving her, and because of that he doesn't want to harm her even though that's his natural instinct, I think that would be a really cool plot. And I think that's got enough conflict. We don't need to add in, you know, these kind of weird controlling behaviors. When thinking about Twilight, another example popped up in my head that, in my opinion, is Twilight for the edgy Tumblr teens, and that's the little love plot in the first series of American Horror Story, Murder House. The love plot between Violet, who's a teenage girl who moves into a house with her family, and Tate. Tate is, how do I describe him? He is a teenage school shooter who is constantly doing Kurt Cobain cosplay, and I think that's an insult to Kurt Cobain because he's too good to be associated with school shooters. Tate also then turns out to be not just a school shooter but also a sex offender, which is great. And they have this love story. It's very dramatic. It's very much this kind of sad, edgy teenagers who feel understood by each other for the first time. And at the beginning, well, not at the beginning, but at some point, Violet finds out that Tate is a school shooter, and she tries to find excuses for him, and she's like, oh, you know, but he's changed since then. You know, she tries to redeem him, to find reasons why he's redeemed himself, because to her he's always lovely, right? He's very nice to her, but he's just not nice to everybody else. But first she tries to defend him and to redeem him. You know, this kind of, oh, he's improved and the rest of it I can fix kind of idea. And then she finds out that he's a sex offender who has sex offended against someone in her family, and then in a shocking turn of events where Ryan Murphy does something reasonable, she dumps him. She's like, fuck off, I'm not talking to you anymore, you did something horrible to someone in my family, stay away from me. The decision basically every dark romance woman should be making. But my point with this is basically that I think this is kind of even a step further, where you get the supernatural element but also a criminal element. Did I say that Tate is a ghost, or did I forget to mention that? He's a ghost. That's why it's supernatural. He's a ghost. He's dead. He's a dead ghost. I hope that any of this will make sense to you when you listen to it. Anyway, I think this is a step further down the dark romance line, with the difference that at the end, the character who's being manipulated and mistreated and being lied to realizes that and ends the relationship. But interestingly, the reception of it, of this whole love story, was very, very romantic. If you were on Tumblr in 2013, you will have seen all the little American Horror Story edits, all the little romantic edits about Tate, and everyone's thirsting about him. I have a good recommendation for everyone. Do not thirst over Evan Peters playing murderers who die in 1994. Just don't. Stop it. If you ever feel the urge to do that, stop. Right. But now I want to get to the type of dark romance that, in my opinion, is a lot more difficult, where we get more into the serious ethical issues, and that is the kind of dark romance that is much closer to reality and therefore much more difficult to spot. By that I don't mean that they're necessarily realistic, but they are set in our real world and sometimes the people in them also have normal jobs and relatively normal lives. So yeah, I believe that these texts are increasingly problematic the closer they are to reality, and especially the less aware they are of the fact that the stuff that's going on in them is not healthy. Because I believe that a dark romance that is self-aware, that knows that what it's writing is a fantasy, right? That it's not something that would be attractive or sexy or even in any way acceptable in real life. Stories like that are probably written a lot more carefully. And the dark romance genre is a genre that needs to be very, very carefully treated, right? If you just write romance where simply, all the men are physically and sexually aggressive towards the women that they are in a relationship with, and that's seen as, oh, he's so strong and manly and powerful and that's hot. But really they're, physically assaulting them and like shoving them into walls or forcing them into sexual acts. Unfortunately, that's what happens a lot in these books. That is, in my opinion, what happens when the books or films aren't really aware of what they are doing. When they're not really aware of, hey, in real life, this is very problematic and it is a thing that happens a lot and it's dangerous. And you wouldn't want this happening to you in real life. If the books aren't aware of that and instead just portray very realistic abusive behaviors as sexy, that is a problem. I'd much rather they just find vampires sexy because it's a lot less dangerous for real people, because you're probably not going to meet a vampire. You could do very interesting romance books that deal with the kind of dynamics that I just described, with these kind of big power imbalances. I think that is something that could be interesting. Although then I guess it wouldn't be romance in that sense, because it would have to examine them critically, right? Or I think that dark romance can be written very, very well, but then there needs to be, there need to be certain lines that aren't crossed. For example, I think dark romance where you have a kind of villains to lovers situation, I think that could work very well, where you have two characters and in the beginning they are rivals and they hate each other and they do bad things to each other, but then they start to build a relationship, they start to like each other, and then they stop doing that. But then again, I suppose a lot of people enjoy dark romance because of the unhealthy dynamics, and yeah, I guess I can't really help that. But what I do want to say is that I believe that self-awareness and skillful writing are particularly important in a genre like dark romance, where there are very, very significant nuances that can make all the difference between something being a good romance story with some dark themes or just abusive, And in line with that, I think it's also a genre where media literacy and critical thinking are particularly important. I think if you read dark romance, you need to be able to critically examine what you're reading and to think about it and be like, hey, okay, in this novel, this is kind of an interesting plot device, interesting characterization, but would I want this in real life? And then you would need to understand that, hey, if this were to happen to someone, it would be horrific. And that distinction is a very important one to be made. And I'm not sure if all readers can make it when I look at the types of, edits you see, for example, on Book Talk and Bookstagram of love interests who are literal serial killers. And they're like, oh my god, it's so hot that he's a serial killer. No, it's not. There are certain things that are never hot. And by that I don't mean that you can't write a compelling evil character. I think compelling and sort of charming and interesting evil characters are great. They are fascinating. I really like them. Some of my favorite examples of that would be Hannibal in the NBC Hannibal series. I think he's great. And that's also a show that kind of goes a little bit into dark romance direction towards the end. But I think it is so over the top and so conceptual and so artistic that I don't think anyone would be like, I want that in my life, you know. Anyway, charming and compelling villains or charming and compelling sort of anti-heroes are great characters, but I think it's important that they are viewed by the text in a critical way. And that is something that I think delineates the difference between whether something is a dark romance or a thriller or horror. Because these genres can be very close to one another and sometimes they are misread as one another. And I will give you an example of that in a second. That distinction of, are the actions of this charming evil character seen critically or are they just seen as attractive, you know? I think that's the sort of key difference. But again, I think that is something that's very individual, because the way a book is written, of course, has a huge impact on how it's received, but the reception also really depends on the reader, and readers can read the same book very differently. They might pick up on different details, they might interpret certain actions in different ways. And through this, I think the distinction between the horror or thriller genre and dark romance often lies in the reception. And just to bring up another example that Rachel mentions in her video of a situation where it's clear that someone is a villain. She uses the example of Stephen King's It, and she says that, you know, everyone who reads this knows that Pennywise is a villain and who's clearly recognizable as a villain. We're, you know, to draw the kidnapping parallel, when he kidnaps people, that's not sexy, right? Because he's recognizable as the villain and we're supposed to see his actions critically and negatively. And here I come in with my point of reception being important, destroying that, because, you know, that episode of Stimmen im Kopf that I just mentioned earlier on talked about people being attracted to horror clowns. And they specifically mention Pennywise as well. Apparently Pennywise is very popular in a certain demographic, especially among young women. So even though Stephen King probably didn't write Pennywise with the intention of anyone being attracted to him, some people are attracted to him. So this episode that I just mentioned of the Stimmen im Kopf podcast, the woman who kind of writes and researches the podcast, she's called Denise, and she did a little survey in like subreddits, and this was not about Pennywise, it was about Art the Clown from Terrifier. But I think the point still stands. You know, they're murderous horror clowns. I think they are somewhat comparable. She asked in the subreddits about the Terrifier films whether any of the people there were attracted to Art the Clown, because she'd seen all these like TikToks about people fancying him. And she did get quite a few answers. And she asked people why they found him attractive. And the things that really emerged throughout these answers were that he's powerful, you know, because he's the one who can destroy everyone, he's powerful, and mysterious. And they also like that he doesn't talk. These are precisely elements that we also find in the dark romance love interest, right? The power, the kind of mystery element that, you know, you would get with supernatural creatures, for example, but also, you know, members of the mafia. But of course also someone like Christian Grey. I think Christian Grey really fits these things. He's powerful, he's mysterious because he doesn't talk about his private life. He generally doesn't really talk a lot of useful stuff. He's very silent. Is Christian Grey Art the Clown as a millionaire? Let me know what you think. But yeah, and there are so many examples of texts that are not intended as dark romance, but that are received as such. One example of this would be the show You, which is marketed as a thriller, and which from my perspective also is a thriller, but that was received by many as a dark romance in the sense that they found the lead attractive as a romantic interest. And to briefly summarize, You is a thriller show, a psychological thriller series about a guy called Joe Goldberg who is a stalker and a murderer. So basically his thing is he finds a woman that he is attracted to, he falls in love with her like crazy, and then he just stalks her and does everything to get with her, no matter if he has to murder people for it, manipulate people for it, do any sort of crazy shit. He doesn't care, he just wants this woman now. Apparently a lot of viewers thought that was really romantic and they wanted to date someone like him. And I think here it is this combination of the power through violence that we've seen before, combined with a romantic motivation. You know, I think it's very easy to put yourself in the shoes of this one woman that he does everything for, because then you're the special one who will not get harmed, the special one he'll do the craziest shit for, and that probably makes you feel very good about yourself. And all those people who die in the process, well, who cares about them, I guess. Unfortunate. Or there's a very classic example that I find really fascinating in the dark romance context, especially with the roots in the Gothic genre I talked about at the very beginning, because this is a classic Gothic novel, Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is the only novel by Emily Bronte, one of the Bronte sisters. She died very young. And it follows a family who lives in the Yorkshire moors. In this family, there's a young woman called Catherine Earnshaw, and there's also a guy that they find somewhere. He's called Heathcliff. And they have this very strange kind of romance from a very young age. But then Catherine marries another guy who's actually really nice to her, and Heathcliff, he's this very dramatic, impulsive, violent, dark guy who's always losing it. And he's also very, very affected by her marrying someone else, and he's heartbroken. And then shortly after, Catherine dies, and basically he is haunted his whole life by her and this love for her. What's also very important to say is that the whole family is very abusive. There's a lot of emotional and physical abuse, but Heathcliff just takes it to a whole new level. He's just absolutely horrible to everyone. He treats everyone like absolute crap, but he is very, very much driven by this deep, deep love for Catherine. And again, I think we see a similar theme. You know, we see a person who's very violent and dangerous, but they have this one person that they're really fixated on and they will do anything for them. I think that's very, very effective for dark romance readers, right? The interesting thing about Wuthering Heights is that it's a text whose reception has changed so much over time, and it keeps flip-flopping, and there's a huge debate about whether it is a love story, you know, the story of this undying, immortal love between Heathcliff and Catherine. You've probably seen this quote of, whatever souls are made of, his soul and mine are cut from the same cloth, or something like that. It's a very beautiful quote where Catherine talks about Heathcliff, right? So there's this romantic undercurrent, not undercurrent, the very strong romantic just current. And for some people that is the main strand of the book, right? For them it's about their love story. Whereas for others it's basically a psychological Gothic horror about the way the people in this family keep abusing one another in horrific ways. I mean, there's this one guy, I think he's Catherine's brother. I struggle a little bit with the names because a lot of the people have the same names as their parents. It's a bit confusing. But he threatens to throw his baby off the gallery in the middle of the house, and then they sort of beat up dogs and other horrible things. They are very brutal. You know, there's people for whom the book is more about that, about these horrific, psychologically tormenting dynamics in this family, and also in the relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff. Personally, I see it as a very meticulous and ahead of its time psychological study of a very unhealthy family. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend reading it. We actually have a little bit of a hint to what the intended reception was, because there's, in certain copies, in certain editions, there's a foreword by Charlotte Bronte, who's Emily Bronte's sister, and she says that Heathcliff is a villain, and she even calls him a villain that's almost unrealistic in how villainous he is, which I also find an interesting thing to consider in the context of him being seen as a romantic hero, right? Maybe he can become a romantic hero because he is almost unrealistically villainous and not just a little bit villainous. I don't know. What Heathcliff is agreed upon to be is a Byronic hero. Now, the concept of the Byronic hero is he's the kind of hero that Lord Byron wrote. To briefly describe him, the Byronic hero is the guy at the back of a philosophy class who's cosplaying as Morrissey and tells everyone why they are wrong about everything and he knows better than them. That's a Byronic hero. He's intelligent but very aloof. He's usually very arrogant. Also doesn't typically follow general moral rules, but is focused on what he wants. And because of all these things, he's an outsider. But he's not frustrated about this. He's proud of his outsider status and proud of not adhering to social norms and rules because he believes he's above them. He doesn't need them. He's better than society. And this kind of character often has a dark past, a lot of the time a criminal past, that makes him so bitter and so angry at everyone, right? It's a character that's repulsive and attractive at once. I don't know about you, but the Byronic hero might be our key to the intrigue of the dark romance love interest. It is this combination of the repulsive and the attractive. Both the Byronic hero and the typical dark romance love interest is this outsider. He's not like everyone else. He kind of stands out through being dark and being mysterious, but also, you know, they are usually sort of on the clever side, not always, but they have this aloofness and this superiority over others, right? And I think it is this superiority that we then see in the kind of dominant love interest of dark romance. There's this pride of not fitting societal norms, which I think also fits the desires of people who want to read dark romance, because they want to read a romance that goes beyond the kind of socially acceptable, nice, kind, polite type of romance. The dark romance lead or love interest, the leading man, is simply a Byronic hero from the Pornhub era. And I think it does make sense to link these two figures, because the Byronic hero is often considered to have influenced the kind of sexy vampire figure. In fact, they are often directly linked, that the Byronic hero is the sort of prototype for the sort of Anne Rice type sexy vampire, for example, who is a classic dark romance type love interest. We're connecting the dots. It all leads back to Lord Byron. Of course, it's always this man. The problem with this, I think, is not necessarily that people will read romance books about vampires and werewolves and monsters and stuff like that, or even about mafia bosses who kidnap them. A lot of people are capable of understanding that this is not something they would want to experience in real life. But sometimes I think the boundaries between these fictional bad guys, these fictional Byronic heroized criminals, and the real world get blurred. And that is when we have a problem. And here I want to get back to a point that both Mina and the Stimmen im Kopf podcast bring up, and that is the link between dark romance and true crime fascination, or a certain type of true crime fascination. Dark romance and true crime are two genres that are both experiencing a peak in popularity at the same time right now. Mina talks about how this is probably connected, because both of these genres kind of feed this fascination for the dark, for the forbidden, and the powerful through violence, right? And Denise from Stimmenkopf, she also says that this desire for power, this attraction to power that feeds the attraction to horror villains, is linked to, or is comparable to hybristophilia, which is a phenomenon where people are attracted to violent criminals. I definitely see how there is a connection there between the dark romance genre and, I don't want to say the true crime genre as a whole, because I do think that the true crime genre has a lot of different types of texts, you know, but there are certainly certain kinds of true crime texts, and especially the way certain people approach, or certain ways in which people can approach true crime texts, and these are these kind of glorifying, romanticizing approaches. This kind of thing is the one where we have to be very, very careful with, because if it feeds this loop of glamorizing and romanticizing actual criminals, I think then we have a problem. You know how recently there's been the case of this guy who, I'm not sure what his name is, the guy who's got the same name as Deadpool with the face tattoos, the guy who murdered 2 women, and then suddenly, like, all these random ladies on TikTok were like, oh my god, he's so hot and I can change him, blah blah blah. And I think this is where we need to be very, very careful. Now, I don't want to say that dark romance is the reason why there's this romanticization of real criminals among certain types of true crime enjoyers, because, you know, that has happened long before dark romance became this popular. I don't want to say that one is causing the other. I think they are caused by the same underlying mechanism, which is this desire to gain power through being with a violent person. And I think it is this thing, this desire of being important and powerful by being with a violent person, that is the issue, because the violent person is probably not going to be nice to you either. Even if they're nice to you, you're still then kind of complicit in the hurting of other people, and that's a problem. This point of these two types of glorification of violent men, once in dark romance and once in true crime, are also connected by the fact that they are both genres heavily influenced by Gothic literature that has this combination of danger and death and the aestheticized and the erotic. Because both of these genres are so influenced by this connection, I think we are sort of used to seeing them come up together. We are used to seeing violence and sex combined in a lot of media. And I believe that that is something we need to be very, very aware of, and we need to be thinking about when we consume texts that do combine these two elements. That is the most important thing to draw from this little yap, from this little incoherent talk here. These are simply genres, you know, because they hinge on a link of two things that are kind of precarious when linked: violence and sexual attraction and romantic love. That is a dangerous link at the core of it all, and because of that, I think that a genre like dark romance that hinges on this precarious, dangerous link needs to be particularly responsible, and the readers need to be particularly responsible. I know this kind of goes against the idea of dark romance being a fantasy and something to enjoy and to escape reality, but if you like reading books or watching films where women are abused or people in general are victims of horrific crimes by the person you're then meant to be attracted to, I think maybe it's worth thinking about why that is such a nice escapist fantasy for you. It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to have it, but I think it's something to critically think about and be aware where exactly your lines are, where your moral standpoint lies, and what is and isn't acceptable if it were to happen in real life. just turn on the critical thinking. Then I think it should be okay, right? And finally, there's one point that I find really fascinating that kind of emerged throughout this little talk, and that is that dark romance, by its own fans, at least that's my experience as a user of book-related social media, by dark romance fans, the genre is often seen as a bit transgressive, a bit edgy, a bit rebellious, something where you can overstep boundaries in a safe way, and you're kind of not like the other girls who like to get flowers instead of being flagellated. I find it really interesting that it is seen as rebellious and transgressive when so much dark romance reproduces very traditional patriarchal structures, centering around a very powerful man who dominates a woman, who comes to accept her place as the dominated part and comes to enjoy it. Isn't that surprisingly close to the fundamental conservative wet dream that women should obey their husbands? The trad wife fantasy for the edgy 2013 Tumblr girls. And remember, it's all Lord Byron's fault. And with that, we've reached the end of this, I hope not very incoherent little yap. Let me know what you think about dark romance. Do you like dark romance? Have you read any dark romance? Did you enjoy it, or did you find it a little bit weird? I'd love to hear what you think. There's going to be a little survey under this episode right on Spotify, as there usually is, so you can vote on your views on dark romance, but you can also send me a message on Instagram at Midnight Culture Club. You can also leave a comment under this episode, but most importantly, tell your friends about this podcast. Recommend it to anyone you think might enjoy it. Recommend it to the mailman. Recommend it to your friend who loves Colleen Hoover. Recommend it to your friend who hates Colleen Hoover. Let them fight under a single light bulb in a dark room full of shirtless men. Because, as you all know, the first rule of Midnight Culture Club is to tell everyone about Midnight Culture Club. And with that, I shall withdraw into the now post-midnight. It is 1:18 in the night, and I should be going to bed. And of course, I hope to see you again soon here on the nocturnal side. Sweet dreams and good night.